All right, some fascinating notes here from someone named Tommy, and it looks like a real deep dive into three regions of southwest China, Guangxi, Guizhou, and Qinghai. But what really caught my eye is that they're not just the typical tourist spots. Tommy seems to be going after those hidden cultural gems. We're talking snail noodle soup, endangered monkeys, singing competitions, even a lake called the Water Tower of China. Color me intrigued.
It's a region ripe for exploration, that's for sure. And what's fascinating here is that these notes touch upon not just what makes each region unique, but how that uniqueness came to be.
Okay, let's unpack this. First up, Guangxi. Tommy points out it's incredibly diverse even for China. Zhuang people are the majority minority, but you've also got Han Chinese, Dong, Miao, Yao. It's like a cultural crossroads.
And its location has always made it strategically important. Think back to the dynastic changes, even the Taiping Rebellion Guanxi was right in the thick of things. So this blend of cultures isn't accidental, it's woven into the very fabric of the region's history.
Which brings us to the song festival tradition of the Zhuang people. Tommy describes these massive gatherings where everyone's singing in this call and response style, almost like a musical conversation celebrating their heritage.
It's more than just singing, though, wouldn't you say? It's like a living embodiment of their oral history, their connection to the land, their very identity. And speaking of powerful figures, it reminds me of the legendary third sister Lu, a folk heroine known for her singing, who became an icon in Chinese cinema.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
There was even a famous film about her in 1961.
Now, when I think of Guangxi, I also think of food, and Tommy does not disappoint. They've got lucifin noodle soup, which apparently includes river snails, pickled bamboo shoots, tofu skin. I'm not even sure what tofu skin I asked, but it sounds adventurous.
Adventurous is a good word to describe Guangxi from its cuisine to its landscapes. Those dramatic karst formations aren't just visually stunning. They create these unique microclimates that support all kinds of biodiversity.
Give us some examples. What kind of unique stuff are we talking?
Well, you've got the Yunnan pine, various orchid species, even the white-headed langur, an endangered primate found only in that region. So you're not just tasting a culture in Guangxi, you're tasting an entire ecosystem.
Okay, so Guangxi's got the nature and the culture going on. Now, Tommy's notes say Guizhou somehow manages to be even more ethnically diverse over 18 distinct groups. How do you even wrap your head around that much variety?
Guizhou has long been a cultural crossroads, especially during the Ming Dynasty. What's fascinating is how each group maintains its distinct traditions while also influencing those around them. It's like a constant conversation, a back and forth across centuries, expressed through everything from festivals to music to the food itself.
And speaking of festivals, Tommy highlights three. The Miao New Year, with its incredible costumes and dances. The Sisters' Meal Festival, where young women express affection through colorful rice dishes. And the Lisheng Festival, which celebrates this unique reed pipe instrument.
The Lisheng Festival actually reminded me of the Dong Grand songs, which are UNESCO-recognized examples of polyphonic singing. It's this incredibly complex style where multiple voices sing different melodies that somehow harmonize together.
Okay, polyphonic singing sounds pretty mind-blowing. It's like their voices are weaving a tapestry of sound.
Yeah.
But before we lose ourselves in the music, what about Guizhou cuisine? What did Tommy discover there?
Guizhou's food is as bold as its landscapes. Think sourfish soup, for example, which is exactly what it sounds like, tangy, flavorful, and a bit of an acquired taste. And for a completely different experience, there are siwawa rice wraps, delicate little bundles of deliciousness.
And it's not just the people who are diverse in Guizhou, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Tommy mentioned endangered golden snub-nosed monkeys and rare orchids. It really makes you think about how closely tied human culture is to the natural world.
Exactly. Protecting those ecosystems isn't just about biodiversity, it's about protecting the cultural heritage they support. And speaking of heritage, the architecture in Guizhou is worth mentioning too. Think drum towers and wind and rain bridges, these incredible structures that act as gathering places for the community, connecting them to their history and each other.
Okay, Guizhou is definitely going on the bucket list, but we can't forget our last stop, Qinghai. Tommy describes it as the source of major Chinese rivers, even calling it the Water Tower of China. So clearly, geography plays a big role here.
Absolutely. The Yangtze, Yellow, and Lancang rivers all originate in Qinghai. And its location on the Silk Road has shaped its cultural landscape for centuries, making it a melting pot of traditions and influences.
That makes sense, given that Tommy mentioned kata scarves, these offerings of white silk that symbolize purity and good luck, which I'm guessing have Tibetan roots.
Indeed. And then you have the Gorchem dance, performed at weddings, this lively circle dance that really captures the communal spirit of the region. And like many cultures, toasting songs are a big part of celebrations, expressing wishes for good health and fortune.
I mean, I'm loving the variety here. We've got call and response singing in Guanxi, polyphonic harmonies in Guizhou, and now heartfelt toasting songs in Qinghai. It's like music is the universal language, regardless of the culture.
It really is, and the music in Qinghai is just as diverse as its people. Think Tibetan folk songs with their spiritual themes, played on instruments like the dranian and duncheon, but you also hear influences from other regions, creating this unique and captivating soundscape.
All right, before we move on from Qinghai, we have to talk about the food. What culinary adventures did Tommy uncover there?
In Qinghai, you're experiencing the cuisine of the highlands. Staples like sampa, roasted barley flour, and yak butter tea, as warming as it is unique, reflect the nomadic heritage and the harsh yet beautiful environment.
And I'm guessing mutton, beef, and dairy products are pretty prominent in the diet.
Absolutely. Think of the Tibetan antelope grazing those high-altitude grasslands, or the snow leopard patrolling the mountains. And then you have Qinghai Lake, a haven for migratory birds. The food reflects the land itself.
It's like each bite is a taste of the region's natural wonders. And just like the other regions, the architecture in Qinghai reflects its diverse cultural influences. Tommy describes a blend of Tibetan Buddhist temples, Islamic mosques, and Han Chinese structures, all adapted to that mountainous terrain.
It's a reminder that when we talk about diversity, we're not just talking about different ethnic groups. We're talking about different ways of life, different beliefs, different ways of expressing ourselves through art, architecture, music, and cuisine.
So we've got Guanxi with its singing rivers and spicy noodles, Guizhou with its polyphonic harmonies and delicate rice wraps, and Qinghai with its toasting songs and yak butter tea. It's a lot to process, but I'm already feeling inspired to learn more. What stands out to you about Tommy's note so far?
What I find fascinating is how each region has adapted to its environment and history, creating these incredibly unique yet interconnected cultures. It really challenges our assumptions about what Chinese culture means. But there's one thing that really has me curious. How does all this diversity play out in people's daily lives? How do these cultures coexist and thrive in a rapidly modernizing China?
That's a great question and one we should definitely explore. Let's take a quick pause and come back to dive deeper into those complexities. I have a feeling Tommy's notes hold some interesting answers.
That's the question that keeps coming back to me. How are these cultures navigating the modern world? Because preserving tradition isn't about staying frozen in time, is it? It's about finding ways to adapt and evolve.
Right, it's that push and pull between honoring the past and embracing the future. And speaking of the past, Tommy's notes on Guangxi mention these Diao Jiaolu, which are basically houses built on stilts.
Yes, particularly common in the more rural areas among the Dong and Miao communities. They're elevated for practical reasons like avoiding floods and pests, but they also have a certain aesthetic appeal, wouldn't you say? They almost seem to blend into the landscape.
It's like their architecture is in conversation with the environment, not just imposing itself on it. And that reminds me of the music we were talking about earlier. Tommy mentions the Bain ensemble used by the Zhuan people. What makes that unique?
It's not just one instrument, but a whole collection. Things like the maguhu, a kind of horse-headed fiddle, and the sangxian, a three-stringed lute. It's often used in storytelling and folk performances, adding another layer to that rich oral tradition we discussed earlier.
So it's not just about preserving the instruments themselves, it's about keeping those traditions alive.
Yeah.
Right, that way of life. And that brings us back to those mind-blowing Dong Grand songs in Guizhou, the ones with the polyphonic singing. Tommy says they often revolve around everyday life, nature, and ancestral stories.
Exactly. It's not just beautiful music, it's a way of passing down knowledge through generations. And it makes you wonder how that form of storytelling might evolve with technology, with social media. Will future generations be sharing these songs on TikTok, blending those ancient melodies with modern beats? It's a fascinating possibility.
It really is. And speaking of blending old and new, Tommy's notes on Guizhou also mention batik and silver jewelry making. Are those crafts at risk of fading away in a world of mass production?
It's a challenge faced by many traditional crafts, not just in China, but globally. But what's encouraging is that there's a growing appreciation for handmade items, for things that carry a story and a connection to a particular place.
So it's about finding that balance, isn't it? Between honoring tradition and finding new markets, new audiences who appreciate those skills. Speaking of finding new audiences, maybe it's time we talk about food again. Tommy mentions Waxy beef noodles in Guizhou. Anything special about those?
They're a local specialty in Waxy City, known for their rich, flavorful broth and tender slices of beef. It's the kind of dish that warms you from the inside out, perfect after a day of exploring the region. But what I find interesting is how even something as seemingly simple as a bowl of noodles can tell a story about a place, about its people, about its ingredients.
It's like each region has its own culinary language, wouldn't you say?
Hmm.
And speaking of languages, Tommy mentions kata in their notes on Qinghai. I'm assuming that refers to those white scarves you mentioned earlier, the ones offered as a gesture of respect.
Exactly. Kata scarves are a powerful symbol of Tibetan culture, representing purity and good luck. They're offered during festivals, weddings, or even just as a way of welcoming someone. It's a tangible expression of their hospitality.
It's like a physical embodiment of that welcoming spirit. And speaking of welcoming traditions, what about those toasting songs Tommy mentions in Qinghai? How do they compare to those more formal Dongran songs we discussed earlier?
Toasting songs are more spontaneous, more about the moment. They're often sung during meals or gatherings, expressing wishes for good health, happiness, and prosperity. It's a way of connecting with people, of sharing in the joy of the occasion.
And it makes you wonder, doesn't it, how technology is influencing these traditions. Are people still gathering around the table to sing, or are those toasts happening in online chat groups now? How does a culture maintain those personal connections in an increasingly digital world?
That's the heart of the matter, isn't it? And it's something we see reflected in many aspects of life in these regions. Take the clothing in Qinghai, for example. Tommy's notes mention woolen robes with colorful patterns and accessories.
Right, they sound both practical and stylish. I'm guessing those woolen robes are essential in the colder climate, but the designs and colors probably hold cultural significance too, right?
Absolutely. The robes, called chuba, are often adorned with intricate patterns and vibrant colors, reflecting the wearer's cultural identity and social status. And then you have the accessories, silver ornaments, turquoise jewelry, elaborate headwear. Each piece adds another layer of meaning to the ensemble.
It's like a walking work of art.
Mm.
But it also makes you think about the impact of globalization, of fast fashion. Are young people still embracing these traditional styles, or are they opting for jeans and t-shirts? How does a culture maintain its visual identity in a world that's constantly bombarded with outside influences?
It's a tension we see playing out everywhere, but I think it's important to remember that cultures aren't static. They're constantly evolving. What we might see as traditional today is often the result of centuries of adaptation and change. And that brings us back to the architecture in Qinghai. Do you remember those examples we were discussing earlier?
Right. You mentioned a blend of Tibetan Buddhist temples, Islamic mosques, and Han Chinese structures. I'm picturing those colorful prayer flags fluttering in the wind outside a temple. Can you give us some specific examples?
Well, you've got the Tara Monastery in Xining, a sprawling Tibetan Buddhist complex that's been a center of religious and cultural life for centuries. It's a truly awe-inspiring sight with its golden roofs, intricate murals, and the constant hum of chanting.
And what about the Islamic influence? You mentioned a mosque in Xining as well.
Yes, the Dongguan Mosque. Its green domes and minarets stand out against the backdrop of the city, a testament to the long history of Islam in the region. And it's not just grand religious buildings, you see the blending of styles in everyday architecture as well. Traditional homes might incorporate Han Chinese courtyard designs while still utilizing local materials like wood and stone.
It's that fusion that I find so fascinating. It's not about one culture dominating another. It's about finding ways to coexist, to learn from each other, to create something new and unique. But architecture isn't the only thing that's grand in Qinghai, right? Tommy also mentioned some incredible natural landmarks.
Ah, yes. We can't talk about Qinghai without mentioning Qinghai Lake, the largest inland saltwater lake in China. Imagine vast stretches of blue water surrounded by snow-capped mountains and grasslands teeming with wildlife.
It sounds breathtaking. And what about those mountains? Tommy mentioned the Kunlun Mountains, which sounded pretty epic.
Epic is a good word. They're a vast mountain range that stretches across western China, often referred to in Chinese mythology as the ancestor of mountains. And their towering peaks and glaciers are truly awe-inspiring. But what I find most fascinating is how the landscape itself has shaped the culture, the traditions, the very way of life in Qinghai.
It's a reminder that we're not just visitors in these places. We're stepping into a complex web of connections between people and the land, between the past and the present. But there's one thing I'm still curious about. What about the languages spoken in these regions? We've talked about the music, the food, the architecture, but what about the everyday conversations? What does that sound like?
Well, you've got quite the linguistic tapestry in these regions, reflecting that same diversity we've been discussing.
Okay, break it down for me. What kind of language mix are we talking about?
Well, in Guangxi, while Mandarin is the official language, you'll hear a lot of Cantonese and various Zhuang dialects, each with its own unique cadence and expressions, adding another layer of complexity to the cultural landscape. And in Guizhou, it's a similar story. Southwestern Mandarin is the most common, but languages like Miao and Dong are still spoken within their communities, each with its own set of proverbs, idioms, and slang that reflect a distinct worldview.
So even within one region, there can be a whole world of languages to discover. What about Qinghai? What's the language situation there?
In Qinghai, you have Mandarin Chinese as the lingua franca, but Tibetan and Mongolian are also prominent, especially in areas with larger Tibetan and Mongolian populations. And just like in Guangxi and Guizhou, each language carries its own cultural weight, its own history, its own way of seeing the world.
It really makes you think about how language shapes our understanding of a place, doesn't it? It's not just a way of communicating, it's a window into a culture's soul.
No.
But I'm curious, how are these languages navigating the modern world? Are they thriving, or are they facing challenges in a country where Mandarin is increasingly dominant?
That's a question worth exploring further, and I think it speaks to the larger issue of how these incredibly diverse cultures are adapting to the pressures of globalization, of modernization. It's a balancing act, isn't it? Holding on to tradition while also embracing the future.
Absolutely, and I think that's a perfect segue into what Tommy's notes really seem to be grappling with. What does this diversity mean for the people living in these regions? How does it shape their lives, their identities, their sense of belonging?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think Tommy's notes provide some fascinating clues. But before we dive into that, maybe we should take a moment to reflect on what we've uncovered so far. Because it's not just facts and figures, is it? It's a glimpse into the heart and soul of a region that's both ancient and incredibly dynamic.
All right, we've explored the landscapes, the music, the festivals, even the noodle soup. But what I keep coming back to is that question you posed earlier. What does this incredible diversity mean for the people who live in Guangxi, Guizhou, and Qinghai?
It's the heart of the matter, isn't it? Tommy's notes provide a glimpse into this vibrant tapestry of cultures, but what's crucial is understanding how those threads weave together to create a sense of identity, both individual and collective.
Right, because it's not just about preserving traditions in a museum, it's about how those traditions live and breathe in the everyday lives of people.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting because for some, this diversity is a source of immense pride. It's what makes their region unique, what sets them apart from the rest of China. Think about the Mao New Year celebrations in Guizhou with those vibrant costumes and dances. It's a powerful statement of cultural identity.
But I imagine it's not always easy, is it? I mean, China is a vast country with a strong push for national unity.
Yeah.
How do these regions balance that with their own distinct identities?
That's the tension, isn't it? And it's something that plays out in different ways. On one hand, you have the government promoting tourism to these regions, highlighting their unique cultures as a way to attract visitors and boost the economy.
Which makes sense. I mean, I'm already planning my trip. But I can see how that could also lead to commodification, to cultures being presented as a spectacle for outsiders rather than something lived and breathed by the people themselves.
That's the challenge, and it's something that many communities are grappling with. How do you share your culture with the world without losing its authenticity, its meaning? It's a delicate balance.
So it's not as simple as saying diversity is good, let's celebrate it.
Yeah.
There are real complexities, real challenges that come with navigating these different cultural identities in a modernizing world. Yeah.
Absolutely. And those challenges play out in everything from language preservation to economic opportunities to social dynamics. For example, as Mandarin becomes increasingly dominant, how do younger generations maintain fluency in their ancestral languages? How do they balance their traditional way of life with the lure of urban opportunities?
It's like those questions we were asking about music and clothing. How do these traditions adapt to the digital age, to globalization? It's a global phenomenon, really, but what's unique to China, I'm guessing, is that layer of national identity, that push for unity.
Exactly. And it creates a fascinating dynamic because while there's this drive for national cohesion, there's also a growing recognition of the value of cultural diversity. It's seen as a source of creativity, innovation, even economic strength.
So it's not necessarily an either situation. It's about finding that middle ground, that space where different identities can coexist and enrich each other.
Precisely. And I think that's what makes these regions so fascinating to study. They're like microcosms of the larger global conversation about diversity, identity, and belonging.
And what's striking to me is how this conversation isn't just happening in academic circles or government offices, it's happening in the streets, in the markets, in people's homes. It's woven into the fabric of everyday life.
Absolutely. And that's why Tommy's notes are so valuable. They offer a glimpse into those everyday moments, those subtle interactions where culture is created, negotiated, and reimagined.
So as I pack my bags for my trip to Southwest China, what's the one thing I should keep in mind? The one thing that will help me really appreciate the complexity of this cultural landscape?
I think the most important thing is to remember that diversity isn't just a statistic. It's a lived experience. It's about listening to people's stories, observing their traditions, tasting their food, and appreciating the unique ways in which they navigate the world.
It's about recognizing that Chinese culture isn't a monolith. It's a tapestry of interwoven threads, each with its own history, its own beauty, its own challenges.
Exactly. And it's a tapestry that's constantly evolving, being reshaped by the forces of modernization, globalization, and the enduring human desire to preserve what makes us unique.
So to all our listeners out there, whether you're planning a trip to Southwest China or simply curious about the world beyond your doorstep, I encourage you to embrace the complexity. Dive deep into those cultures that fascinate you. Ask questions, challenge your assumptions, and allow yourself to be surprised by the beauty of human diversity. Because it's in those unexpected encounters, those moments of shared humanity, that we truly begin to understand the richness of the world we inhabit.
And who knows, maybe you'll even be inspired to create your own set of Tommy notes, documenting your own journey of cultural discovery.
Now that's an adventure worth taking. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the cultural landscapes of Southwest China. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.